Okay, I've recently purchased this Fiat Maserati OSCA engine, which I am planning to put into my own Fiat 1200, which is exactly what Fiat did back in the 60s. So what this is a 1.5 liter engine that was designed by Maserati and built by Fiat. And the deal was that Fiat would also provide engines to the Maserati brothers to build their OSCA cars. So they called it an OSCA engine, which is essentially what OSCA stands for. It's an acronym, and in English it means workshop to make special cars. So it's a little bit of a bland name, but the Maserati brothers were not allowed to use their own name because of some legal sale that they made of their company. So this is essentially a little Maserati engine, 1.5 liters, that I am planning to put in my 1200. And I've been looking for one for quite a while, not like desperately, but just sort of off and on. I'd always be looking, keeping an eye out for one, and one of them popped up near me. And it was very much a surprise because I've been looking in California and Italy and all these places. And as soon as I heard about it, I called them up, I found out what it was, and I went up there and I bought it. So this engine came out of a Fiat 1500 OSCA from the early 60s. And it was supposedly a running engine when it came out, although it is currently stuck. Which is hopefully not a big deal. I just hope the pistons are okay. And so this was in a shop that pulled it out, like to save the engine from a rusty car. And it's just been sitting with all these other engine blocks amongst Lamborghinis and Porsches and Alfa engines. So it's acquired this layer of grime from all the machining operations that they did in this shop. They had machine tools and stuff, Bridgeports and whatnot. So it has this smell of like burnt machine oil, which is sort of pleasant. I really like it, and I'm kind of loath to clean it all up, but of course I do have to do that. So this is a very different engine than the Fiat engines, and I don't want to get into all the differences, but it basically almost doubles the power of my car, so it'll be nice. And one thing that's sort of interesting is I have the Alpha 1.6 liter. I just happen to have one sitting right here, so I'm kind of like looking at the two of them almost side by side. And some of the things I notice like right off is the design of the OSCA engine. It's very similar, but like here you have oil always goes down into this well because it leaks out of the valve covers, and these areas fill up with oil on the Alpha engine. But on the OSCA engine, what they did was they made it flat here, and there's this little ridge, so the oil can't get into the spark plugs, so it rolls off. One of the things that you notice right off about this engine is there's no oil filter, which is a little bit, sometimes they did that back in the 50s. There's a way in here at the end of the crankshaft that spins the particulate out into like little chambers. Sometimes they did that in the crankshaft of these older engines as well. And what you are supposed to do is remove this lower oil pan right here every time you change the oil and clean all the particulate out that may have settled in there. But so people didn't do that. And as a result, the sediment built up, and bad things happened to the crankshaft and other parts of the engine as far as wear goes. Whereas the Alpha engine does have an external oil filter, canister type right there. So that's one thing I see that's possibly a little bit better. Now on the 1600 OSCA engines, they did have an external oil filter, which they put in here somewhere. So that is probably an advantage of a 1600 engine. And this engine was pretty complete. It's missing a carburetor, but I happen to have one, a 36 DCD Weber to go on there, which I think I can tune up to make this run pretty well. It would be really nice to have the two side drafts on here, and I've been playing with the idea of somehow getting a couple of like Solex 32 PHHs from like from my Fiat 1100, and they also use them on some Lancias, and adapting them to a manifold to have a couple little Solex carburetors here, which would also have the advantage of lowering the whole intake assembly, because the hood comes right over here and the clearance is very tight. In fact, I'm not sure I'll be able to close the hood, the stock hood on my 1200, because the OSCA cars, the OSCA Fiats had wider hood bulges to accommodate this sort of like wider engine. Oh, I am stuck for a transmission. I mean, I have a transmission, but I don't have the bell housing that adapts from here to the transmission box itself. So if anyone out there has such a bell housing that they're willing to sell me, I would be interested in it, and let me know in the comments or contact me through my website, thevintageline.com. And there's my operating room light, keeping an eye on things. And here we are after a rather pleasant afternoon, scrubbing the layer of grime off of the block, which I sort of miss, but I sort of don't also. So it did a very good job of protecting all the bare metal bolts and the bare aluminum. The aluminum is mostly in very, very good condition. There's very little corrosion, and I've started taking things apart, and everything's coming apart very nicely. So that layer of machine shop oil was doing its job. And it appears that this engine block was painted red, and there was a green primer underneath, which was likely etch primer. And I believe that this engine is a virgin. In other words, has never been apart. And the reason I say that is all of the bolts so far have said Fiat on them. And if it had been extensively messed with or taken apart for a rebuild, these bolts are pretty much inevitably lost. And I'll show you what the bolt heads look like. Fiat made their own bolts, or had them made. So here, if you can read that, it says Fiat 80. And some of the bolts say Fiat 100, the larger ones. I think that is the grade, the number. So even on the oil pan, the bolts all say Fiat. So I do believe that this engine is a virgin. So hopefully the inside is as nice looking as the outside. I kind of have my doubts about that, but we'll see. I'm just hoping the crank is in good shape. So while I was cleaning the block, I sort of noticed that it was quite a bit bigger than a Fiat 1200 block, which is what I'm replacing it with. And if I measured the block, and I was like, I had a little bit of a a panic attack, because this block is about 4 or 5 inches longer than a 1200 block. And for comparison, I do happen to have a 1200 block sitting on the bench over here. That's the little 1200 motor. That's actually an 1100, but it's the same block. It's 15 inches long, and this block is more like 19 inches long. So I went and checked the engine bay, and what happened is, in order to put this engine in the same engine bay, they took the radiator and moved it forward. So I'm going to have to change the mounting ears on the radiator. No big deal. But yeah, it does in fact fit. It was used in that engine bay. So there it is, ready to be torn apart.